Okay, so I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker for today, my colleague, Katherine Cotter. She's the Associate Director of Research in the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project here at the University of Pennsylvania. She will be talking to us on the topic of visual art and flourishing, understanding the impact of your organization.
So I'm going to do a little bit more workshop-y type of session to get folks thinking about what are the kind of questions important to you and your organization in thinking about this connection between engagement with visual art in whatever form that you do, and flourishing, and thinking a little bit from doing kind of internal research to understand what are the impacts that you're having on your audience's flourishing, and how you might start to think about how to assess and collect data around those pieces. So you should have a yellow sheet of paper. If you don't have one, let us know and Alina will bring one by. It'll just be something for you to be able to take notes for yourself. It is not an assignment. I will not collect it. You get to take it with you. It'll be a nice souvenir. Not as lovely as the art making souvenirs you will have, but it'll be something. And so if we think about art and flourishing, I'll just say from the research that we've been doing and the research I've been doing, it's been focused predominantly on art museums, but that does not mean like other visual art spaces, art making are not connected with flourishing, but that's a little bit of the lens I'm coming to this from. And so just want to kind of note that. And so in some of the work that we've been doing, trying to understand, well, what has been studied, and what is maybe still unknown, and just kind of thinking about what are the likely things that are already happening in these spaces, the likely impacts that are happening. We see that people are having positive emotional experiences, feeling greater positive emotion when they're engaging with art, both art viewing, discussing art with others, going on tours, having slow looking exercises. They feel more engaged with their lives through these experiences. Their mental health implications. So some of the sessions yesterday talked about some of this work, but thinking about reductions in people's stress and anxiety levels, including physiological stress responses. There's lower risk of dementia if we're thinking on a more kind of population health scale, thinking about that kind of bigger scale point. We also see subjective well-being and health are impacted by people's engaging with visual art, so they feel that their well-being is being enhanced, they feel higher quality of life, feel like their physical health is better. And particularly, there's a lot of work around social connection, social disconnect, and the ways in which these institutions and these experiences help to bring people together, make them feel more communal, and reduce things like loneliness. And we heard kind of yesterday from Sunil about kind of the problem of loneliness and this kind of social disconnect. And it seems art spaces can be one place in which to help bring people together. And so one of the other things that we did kind of early on in this work was try not to say like, aha, we are the academics, we know how to study these things. We're like, well, do people who work in this field even care about well-being, care about flourishing as part of their institutional missions, of the goals of arts institutions? And so we did a national survey of folks working within art museums. Some of you, I think, did the survey. I know Susanna did, because I was like, hey, Susanna, do the survey. And so we kind of just asked, what are the current kind of aims or goals or kind of missions of what art museums are trying to achieve? What are the like impacts they're trying to achieve? We asked about a range of things, well-being included among them. And then we asked what ideally should be kind of the emphasis points or the missions of these institutions. We kind of looked to see where was maybe some of that disconnect. And happily for us, because we do well-being research, we saw that there is a weird squiggle on the screen. Interesting. Okay. I don't know where that came from. Cool. But we saw that the biggest discrepancy between what's happening now and ideally where we want to be was in addressing visitor well-being. And so it seems as though that's particularly important in a place of growth that professionals in this space, so many of you, reported to be a place to work toward, but also other things like being a space for community, supporting artists, being a space for social interaction, helping people reflect on and change their worldview. So things that are still very aligned with this flourishing space. When we asked about particular outcomes that are perhaps more likely to be addressed within these spaces, things like helping to improve empathy, closed-mindedness, self-acceptance, self-doubt, and social disconnect were highlighted as really salient. Another thing that came out of this work, though, is we asked, well, how well equipped do you feel as kind of a professional in this space to really address these things and understand these things? And we kind of got responses back saying, like, we want to move towards this, but we don't necessarily feel well equipped to try to do this. And so as a researcher, I was like, okay, that's good, because we can maybe provide some resources, provide some information that may be helpful to start realizing these broader goals. And so I come from an academic research orientation. And so in much of the work that I just kind of shared and reviewed previously, it's really from this academic research perspective, where we're like nerding out in other academic research and that literature and deriving like our questions and our interest points from that, because we want to expand what the academic literature knows oftentimes. And often we're focusing on a more narrow question. And although we're doing this research in arts institutions and in collaboration with arts institutions, we may not necessarily be 100% aligned with what is most important at that time point for that institution in terms of what well-being outcomes or other outcomes are of particular interest. But if we think about organization-led evaluation, often what is being studied and focused on is rooted in that organizational mission, what that strategic vision is, and what maybe they're getting feedback on from their audiences as being important to address or change. And so we're going to think about a little bit more on this organization-led evaluation side today, and we'll work through those worksheets so you can start thinking about what may be important to your organization, may be important to think about in connection with what the work you do and how that might intersect with flourishing, and where you might start thinking about doing evaluation of your own work and moving beyond. And so this is the audience participation portion. So why do you think doing this evaluation could be important for either the field in general or your organizations specifically? I know some of your nays now, so I can call you out.
I can start with some really obvious things.
Mhm.
This isn't my favorite reason, but the funders usually require it. So it's good to show some actual evidence that what we're doing is reaching the goals that we said we were going to reach.
Yeah, so I mean, unfortunately, the reality of institutions and our world is we need money to do our work. And so yes, it can help you better advocate to funders for why the work you're doing is important. Other things, Christine.
Really begin to ascertain two things. One is what's impactful, and if you're fortunate enough to disaggregate data for who, it could be according to gender, age, socioeconomic status, a whole host of demographic categories process. So sometimes you get to outcomes through certain process elements, and the how is often really important in evaluation.
Yeah, so a couple of things there, understanding what impact you're having and maybe for whom. So understanding who you're reaching and who you may not be reaching with the same program, and also kind of why it's reaching them. So what's underlying some of these connections, yeah.
And I think correspondingly, how it could be made to work better.
Yes, so like what improvements could be made, what refinements can be made, how can we improve the work that we're already doing? Right. And so what we're going to kind of work through in the next half hour or so is just kind of thinking about what are the, my slides are being weird, that's fine. What are kind of the different components of thinking through what does it mean to do some of this work in your institution, and just kind of thinking through the logistics, what might be a good starting place, and what things would maybe need to be put into place or organized in order to start executing on this. So it's really going to be like an ideation session. You may be able to tweak some of these things to implement within your organization to better understand it better, but it also can just be a good exercise to start thinking, what could this look like to inspire some things in the future? And so if we think about kind of this as like a 5-step process, we need to start with our research question. So what are we trying to do? What are we thinking about? How are we going to actually address that question? Collect data, actually get people to tell us about their experiences, make sense of those responses that we get, and then importantly, share and leverage those findings. So once we understand what was coming out of those experiences, How can we then implement, use, tell funders, hey, we're doing cool stuff, et cetera. And so first we'll start with research question. And so it can be inspired from a lot of different things. It can be inspired from, like me, doing like nerdy literature reviews and seeing where there's a gap. It could be, oh, I noticed this thing in a program I've been leading for a couple of weeks that I think could be really cool to understand better. It could be, I saw this other museum or this other institution use something. I wonder if that would work. It could be an intuition you have. It could be coming from your new strategic mission that says community is really important. So let's see how we're doing with community. So there's a lot of different ways you can come up with a question that could be interesting and relevant. It's important that your question is going to be interesting to whomever you want to maybe share those findings with. And so if it's just interesting for you, then maybe all of the effort and work that goes into collecting the data may not be best spent, but thinking towards who do you want to share this with and how do you want to share it as you're starting to think about what you want to do can be very helpful. It also should be something that is feasible. So we can have, as James was saying, I think yesterday, we can have really big ideas, but if we have really big ideas and can't do anything with them, it's not as useful. So break it down into something that seems manageable and feasible. And kind of a little bit, Christine, you set me up kind of nicely here. But one way to think about how to structure and kind of coalesce what your research question is who are you focused on? It can be really broad or really narrow. What are you evaluating? So what is the type of engagement or experience you want to understand the impact of? And what are the outcomes or things that you want to see, are we impacting in a particular way? And so, for example, it could be structured such that do older adults participating in a museum mindfulness program show changes in stress? So we're focusing on older adults, we're evaluating this particular program, and we're looking at the outcome of stress. Could also be, does an after-school art making class improve social connection in adolescence? You could go more broadly and just say, do people feel more relaxed after coming to the museum? So really broad audience, really broad outcome, really broad thing that you're evaluating. And so now you have your worksheets. So I would like you to start kind of thinking about your who, what, and your outcomes and start kind of putting those things together. We'll take a couple minutes and then we'll maybe share a couple of things that people are coming up with. So think again in context of your organization, but feel free to get a little imaginative. What would be particularly interesting to you or your organization? Feel free to chat with one another and share with the neighbors. Feel free to keep working, but does anyone have a question or kind of topic that they'd like to share that they're thinking about right now?
So, I work at a unusual space because I'm at Philadelphia's Magic Gardens, and we get a lot of people who don't typically go to museums. We don't go to art exhibitions.
Mhm.
And they're coming, and one of the things that we do these pop-up art making. And after being in the space for a time, typically our numbers are showing that people will eventually drift back and make something.
Mhm.
And it's a lot of people saying that they're not artists, they never make anything, they don't want to make anything, and they'll stand around there. And it's like they get craft curious, kind of like, because they get
Yes.
exposed to this art that is sort of, anybody can do it, you don't have to be an artist, you don't have to, And I'm really curious about that particular group of people who don't have an innate interest in art,
Yeah.
how that making affects their feeling.
What kind of feeling?
Like if it is elevating them in any way, if they're feeling, I don't know, there's been a lot of like anecdotal, like
Yeah.
closeness with the family because they're all
Yes.
doing it together, that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So maybe
Anecdotes are a
we're-
great inspiration for research questions. Yeah, they are. Yeah, so kind of the folks who are like not the traditional kind of arts audience doing some sort of making, so evaluating like that making process on kind of mood and maybe connections with other people. Awesome. Other folks.
Well, and just adding on to that,
Yeah.
and then their attitudes toward art, right? I
Yeah.
think would be a really interesting thing to,
Yeah.
maybe that would be a more enduring thing even than just their initial mood, right?
Yeah, so also kind of potentially seeing, are they more interested in coming back to Magic Gardens or to a different type of art experience? Yeah. Gabby.
Oh, yeah, something that I've been thinking about that piggybacks off of something we were talking about yesterday is within creators, building resilience for, in order to avoid burnout, that I think comes up a lot with artists. But how to do that through the work. And so I was looking at like, obviously I would get into this a lot and the measurement tools, but like, how can artists sort of shore themselves up against burnout through the work that they're doing, whether that's something involving the feedback that they get in a shorter cycle or with community or something like that.
Yeah, so like what tweaks could be made to that either creation process or like the mindset going into that process, or how feedback is interpreted to kind of reduce that burnout, potentially cultivate things like resilience. Yeah. Any other questions folks wanted to share? That's fine. All right, now we get into some nerdy details. So thinking about your methodology. And so I'm not going to do a full deep dive into like research methods and statistics. You're not some of my undergrads who have to suffer through those details. But kind of thinking in some like broad strokes of things to think about. We can think about quantitative assessment methods. And so these responses are represented numerically. There are many scales that exist or quantitative measurements to assess things like mood, connection, resilience, burnout, and probably many of the other outcomes that you described. But there could also be more simple ways of doing it. For example, how relaxed did you feel on a scale of 1 to 7 after this experience? And you can kind of calculate things from those numbers. As part of a response to that survey we conducted with art museum professionals and seeing that we don't necessarily have the tools to move into this space. One of the things we did was develop a core art museum survey for well-being, assessing 5 different modules designed for assessment in an art museum context, but could easily be adapted to an art making context or other kind of space. They're general enough that there could be a little bit of wording tweaking to be appropriate for those spaces. That assesses things like psychological distress, social connection, empathy, positive self-regard, so like self-esteem and self-efficacy and meaning and purpose. You can download the survey if you're curious. It is freely available. It's also on our website. So you can think about, are there things already out there? I don't have to reinvent the wheel with many quantitative scales. A drawback of quantitative scales is you're just getting a number out. So if you want some of that rich understanding of people's like lived experiences and things along those lines, you're not necessarily going to get that from a quantitative measure. So that's why we have a qualitative methods. These will get a little bit more rich kind of narrative from your respondents. You can kind of see in their own words how they describe their experiences. So these can be open-ended questions that could be on an online survey that you're not doing, but could also be conducted through focus groups with individuals having an experience, could be done through individual interviews with folks to understand those experiences. And it can be like a really open question, such as, did your experience impact your well-being and how? Or did it impact your mood? Did it impact your thoughts about being a creator or this process, or just having people just share what was this experience like for you. Sometimes it's nice to have both. So we ask them, how relaxed did you feel? Also, like, what was that experience like for you? You might see a lot of people mention, I felt more connected, and that wasn't necessarily a goal of your program, but is maybe like a benefit that you didn't realize you were having for that program, for example, or that experience that you're cultivating. So it can be really nice to have both methods, but both aren't necessary. You can pick one or the other, mix and match, but kind of keeping those both in mind. But also, there's probably some other things that you want to assess beyond just kind of your well-being outcome, like demographic information, like Christine was saying, who are you capturing? So it's good to get things like age, gender identity, race and ethnicity, maybe social economic status, or other things like, have you come to this institution before? How often do you engage in art making, or things along those lines to better understand who you're capturing and who you're seeking to understand. So now we go back to our worksheets. So thinking about that research question that you just generated, what might be some kind of things that you would be interested from like a methodology? Do you think a quantitative or qualitative approach feels more appropriate given the type of information you're seeking with that research question? How might you try to kind of assess that outcome? Do you want to do it through an interview? Do you want to find a scale that exists? And what are those other pieces of information that you think are going to be particularly important to collect in the context of your question? So I'll give you a few minutes to jot down some notes and then we'll come back. Yeah.
Where would you put observation of behavior? Or does it depend how it's being tallied or?
Sorry, they're cutting down a tree and I just saw a branch fall. I was like, there's a big branch falling out there, but it is a controlled drop. It is okay. Sorry. So I would say oftentimes if you're like, how long did someone spend looking? That would be quantitative. Most behavioral coding often goes in a more quantitative realm.
Makes sense.
But there could be some exceptions to that, yeah.
What would be a benefit from any of those?
Yeah, so there's benefits and drawbacks to all of them. Quantitative, it's a lot easier to like deal with the data. You can plug it into Excel and get a bunch of statistics out. Do like tests like, did it statistically improve or not? But you don't get necessarily depth of like lived experiences. You might miss something if you don't measure it. Whereas qualitative, it's less fixed what you're going to get out, but you probably are going to potentially get a more full understanding of that experience. The data also is a little bit more laborious to process. So it's really like cons, like both have pros and cons. And so it's kind of think about like for that research question, what is going to be most useful is understanding what's generally happening. Then qualitative might be more appropriate. You're like, I want to know, are people feeling more or less relaxed after my thing? Quantitative might be more appropriate because you can analyze it a little bit differently. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, like,
Yeah, I thought too, and then.
like it's not on there.
It's not. coming from both of these projectors.
It's
Even
just-
like, only one projector's on this.
Oh,
So-
sure. Must be on Zoom.
That's what I think we figured out for the next.
That's very
Okay, I think like when you click the thing to make the overlay go away, there's also like a draw on the screen option and
Yeah.
somebody must have accidentally.
Oh, okay.
It's fine.
So that's hard.
Yeah, yeah. This is creativity. It's like, it's a constraint. It's introduced to everybody's experience. Do you focus on the squiggle or do you focus on Katherine? The tree. Or the tree. Okay. I was just like,
So that would just.
okay, I was like, there's a tree. Let's feel like Katherine.
Sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's more like I should sit there.
I was really.
So what methods are folks feeling maybe more drawn to or more interested in for your
What is-
questions?
I can,
Yeah, Rebecca.
so I'm interested in mixed methods because I think there are things you get from each of them, so. You have to do interviews, because there are things that they will say that you could never have dreamed of.
Yeah.
Actually, those quotes become so rich,
Mm-hmm.
for sort of explaining the data in a lot of ways. So I'm a big supporter of interviews. But I've also been looking at a bunch of different scales in terms of thinking about like the quantitative side of things. For example, I'm interested in measuring like reflective capacity. So I found the Groninger scale, which might work well. Sort of self-awareness and what does that look like? There's SAAS that sort of is meant to measure that. And I've been looking at different flourishing scales, thinking about which ones are one more adaptable, but two sort of make sense. I keep seeing a lot on the languishing flourishing scale, the sort of MHC short form as being a good option. And then lots of people obviously use Tyler's model from Harvard. And sort of pick and choose which elements of the.
Like there's a lot of skills out there.
Yeah,
Yes,
there's
there are
a
many,
lot.
many options.
So I guess maybe, not that we need to ask you a question, but
Alright.
if I were to have a question, it would be around your thoughts on those various scales and how you guys have been, I noticed which ones you choose and just how you guys are making those decisions around which flourishing scale you use and why.
Yeah, it depends a lot on like what the motivation is going into the project and what is like the core thing that you want to capture. So even though it might be, there's like 6 different like general flourishing scales out there, they're all kind of doing it a little bit differently. So if you're looking at an existing scale, something that I do is look through the items rather than, oh, it's a social connection scale. That's perfect. But it might not necessarily make as much sense for your context, for your who that you're focusing on, because sometimes the scales are developed for like with college students in mind, and maybe you're really focusing on older adults and want to focus in that direction, perhaps. Yeah, so it depends a lot. There's some kind of common ones that you end up liking once you use and see that it makes sense for a particular context. But yeah, it's like hard to say like use this one without, because it's going to depend a lot on what your question is, what your context is, and who you're focusing on.
Catherine, can you say something about state versus trait and high versus low arousal? Those might be.
Yeah, so for kind of state versus trait measures, a state measure is something that's like kind of a momentary, more likely to kind of shift over time, whereas a trait tends to be a more kind of stable property of an individual. So personality is often thought to be more like trait-like, mood and emotion tend to be more state types of things. If you are measuring emotion, make sure you are measuring things at a variety of kind of arousal levels. So if we think of, and that's just kind of like how energized the emotion is. So if you think about like negative emotion being like angry is like a much more like high energy type of emotion versus like feeling sad, which is like a much more low energy. In some of the work we've been doing for like positive emotions in regards to art, we see more movement with those like low arousal emotions, like feeling relaxed or content rather than like excited or energized, for example. So it can be good to measure a range of things, particularly like for emotion, to make sure you're seeing like where exactly that emotional impact or mood impact would be. Any other kind of method questions or things people were thinking about as you were kind of imagining what you're, so I'm not doing it as nice as tomorrow, where it's just like paint your picture and do all of the thing, right? I'm just like, I did not arts up the framework, but that's okay. Yeah.
Part of my thought that the in the field, so much of measurement comes down to the burden of what we're asking and how much time we have. That when working with people, they came to for not to be in our master's project.
No.
Or just being so generous with their time. Like, it's nice to do like the big interview and scale, but maybe we get like 3 minutes on a single sheet on a clipboard. That's often been, you know, making the best of what you can do with the graciousness of your participants is often what settles it for us.
Right. Give me a little segue into my collect data one, so thank you. So yeah, so kind of like how you're collecting data is going to inform how you develop your methodology, but since we're kind of prospecting and kind of imagining here, we'll kind of separate it out into a separate thing. But kind of thinking about, you identified your who, but how are you going to actually contact and interact with them to ask them or invite them to complete whatever measurement you're asking about? You could think about it as like, you already send out an evaluation for the classes that you have. Do you just sneak in a few well-being items into that evaluation? So everyone who can kind of completes a program is asked. If you're doing a really broad, everyone who's coming into the museum, like we want to care about people's like museum experiences or just experience with our space. Every like 5th person who leaves, we're like, hi, would you like to do this survey? Do you like stick a QR code somewhere in a gallery or somewhere in your actions like, hey, tell us about your experience, and have some of those questions in there? You probably, like, I'm imagining many of your institutions already do some sort of like evaluation of people or ask like, how satisfied were you with your visit? Can you slip in a couple different questions into those to capture some of that well-being impact? So thinking about some of those existing infrastructures that you might already have that you could collaborate on potentially. What data collection method is being used? Are you doing this online? Are you doing it on paper as a survey? Are you doing those individual interviews? Are you doing focus groups? So kind of thinking about some of the logistics of how are you capturing those responses from your audience, and what resources are necessary. And so this kind of gets a little bit into it. So one resource you need is like the goodwill of your audience to agree to do this. So there's definitely an important part of kind of keeping in mind what you're asking them to do and what's reasonable. And so brevity is often very welcome. If there's some sort of incentive or kind of thank you, like I've done it before where we had some like old postcards from old exhibitions donated by museums, and we were like, hey, would you like one of these if you do the survey? A lot of people get really excited about those postcards. It can work. Or like a discount at the store. I know some of these things are not necessarily feasible for all institutions, but thinking about, is there like a little nice thing that we can do for the folks who are taking the time to tell us deeply about their experience? But all their resources could be, if you're doing something online, do you have like software or like technological infrastructure already in place? And what does it mean to interact with that? If you're like physically in person doing something or over Zoom and having like this synchronous kind of experience, what sort of personnel resources are necessary to stop every 5th person leaving your space or to conduct those interviews? So just take a moment to think about what are the types of resources, how might you try to interact and gain those responses based on kind of the question you're coming up with, the like methodology you're starting to think about. So kind of take another couple minutes to start working through those pieces. So again, how are you inviting people to complete your evaluation? What method might make the most sense given your institution, given your question, given the people you're hoping to capture responses from, and what resources do you already have or could you likely tap into? And what ones might you need to figure out logistically to complete this evaluation? So take another minute or two to think about those.
So curious, because you didn't mention. Yeah. Right. We should first always. We have very few advanced classes. Right, we don't want to. Beginners. So you're very still doing. And it's like interesting to me because I'm just staying on the side of this, but they don't know we're too. But I'm like, like. Yeah, and it tends to be. It's possible that I would do.
Not necessarily, but
What's the research like?
I don't think I have to know that. We don't. Easy fun ways that's what it after on the site.
Yeah.
Make sure.
Yeah.
So. And I think just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not gonna happen.
You're also rooted in like more deeper overall conversation with students and stuff.
Yeah.
So pleasure is so.
Yeah.
Right. So specific.
Yeah.
So specific.
They don't know.
This.
Which you don't kind of get.
You don't have
different.
Hey, you think of the past now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's a lot easier to be curious.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting. This is. Can you recommend it? So I want to know why.
Yeah.
Not, it's not.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't think of. Yeah.
All right, just for the sake of time, we're going to kind of combine and think about after you actually all right, we're gonna just kind of move on in the sake of time, just to kind of think about you get responses, what do you do with them? And so again, this is not going to be a statistics or analytic crash course, but if you have kind of quantitative data, things like computing averages, measures of variability, doing some statistical analyses to see from like before the visit to after, did you see a change? Or for people who did the program versus not, were there differences? Or for different kind of demographic groups, were we seeing differences? You can do it a lot in Excel. You don't need like fancy software. Excel is great. You can make graphs there. If you have folks that are data nerds, you probably rope them into doing some fancier things with your data potentially, collaborating with them early so they know what data they're getting. I'm just like, I see Carrie being looked at as that person. If you have qualitative data, you're often going to be kind of looking through those sets of responses and identifying what are the commonalities that are popping up, what are the themes that are coming out of it, and pulling out some of those representative quotes, as you were saying, Rebecca, to like illustrate that. So if a lot of people saying like, I felt more connected, what's some good quotes that really illustrate this idea of feeling connected through that experience? A resource that would be necessary is like, someone to actually go through all of those responses and see what's happening. And so just kind of think briefly from dealing with the data, just kind of what resources do you already have at your institution? What ones may you need? So just take a minute to think about what sort of resources may need. For some of this, it might be collaborating with an academic partner to do some of this data processing, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be fully internal to do some of this work. There could be outside individuals that help to collaborate on some of this work. So just take a moment and think about what resources are there, what ones might need to be found to really dig into that question that you've developed.
Students, and I'm just thinking about the research.
we were statistics, which is clearly none of us are gonna ever. But it doesn't align, like, trends or like, help to think about how to do curriculum or make this like agency measure. Really after classification of things like sometimes. Yeah. Here. You'll be able to. So, yeah, I think to really do this would have to be introduced. Kind of have a sense of something like, it's like. It's so much more. It's more useful for you, but like, yeah, there needs to be.
All right, so you have your question, you have an idea of methodology and how you're going to get your information. You have some thoughts on maybe what is needed to actually process that. And now the exciting thing, sharing and leveraging your findings. So kind of getting the word out and sharing and thinking about who is this information going to be useful for? How can it have an impact beyond just we have numbers and data and quote, isn't that exciting? For me, that is exciting in its own right, but it's important to go a step beyond that. And so reporting findings to relevant stakeholders, that could be people internal to your institution, it could be boards, it could be funders, it could be policymakers who should have this information because they can maybe take action in response to it. Someone said, I think making changes or thinking about if I just evaluated this program, what things seem to go really well? Were there things that we're really aiming to help people feel connected and it maybe didn't work as well? What modifications could we make to that program or to that experience that might facilitate that a little bit better? You can use that as like a feedback mechanism for improving your work, but also for advocating for your organization. So again, going externally and kind of showing, look, our work is having a measurable impact on some sort of flourishing outcome. So to wrap up the session, I'd like you to think about who are the stakeholders that make the most sense for this work to be shared with, thinking about the data that would be coming out. What ways can those findings be applied to practice? So how can they be used as that kind of feedback mechanism? And how can those findings be used for advocacy? So take 1 minute, / you can also do this into the break. I'll also hang around if there's like methods, nerdy questions, but just kind of take a minute to jot down some of these thoughts about who's going to care about this, how can you use this to advocate, and how can you put this into practice within your institutions?